we're almost done with the power of positive thinking. This book that we've been doing, I only intended to do a few chapters, but we did the whole book, so you could say you read a whole book at church. But I do think we're better for going through it. It's been helpful week after week to remind myself that I do have the power to orient my perspective towards positive thinking no matter what I'm dealing with. And that is a blessing. But it's also a curse. Because let's face it, when life knocks you down, when we feel hopeless or defeated, hearing, just think positively, doesn't always land the way that we want it to. It's like the person who says, just cheer up. Oh, thank you, I forgot. No. When you're clearly in the dumps, it's not exactly the magic cure you're looking for. Yet Norman Vincent Peale, in all his wisdom, reminds us that the gospel has the power to help us overcome whatever life throws at us. So what's at the center of our faith story? Let's think about it for a second. A good person sent from God comes to teach, heal, help, and guide people. And then he gets killed. And we call that story what? The good news. That's some pretty impressive positive thinking right there. The gospel is in many ways a tragedy that we celebrate. It's the ultimate plot twist, and it's our reminder that even when things are grim, there's something bigger at work. Now, a series on the power of positive thinking wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about grief, heartache, and what happens when we find ourselves in truly tragic circumstances. This was the chapter this week. I didn't fabricate this. Interesting. Those who know me know how meaningful this might have been. So he wants to talk about how to apply positive thinking in the moments when we have grief and heartache. Can positive thinking help with that? Or is it just another idea that sounds nice, but when things get hard, we throw it aside? Here's where God has a funny way of teaching me. You see, I can stand up here and tell you about grief, but truth be told, I know grief and heartache very, very well. My childhood was littered in grief and heartache, and as a parent, I've had to deal with tragic circumstances. So let's just say I don't just preach the message, I'm also a customer. Now, before we dive any deeper, let's do what Socrates would have us do. We got to define our terms. We may have different definitions of grief and heartache, so let's be clear. Grief, according to the dictionary, is a deep sorrow, especially caused by someone's death. Anybody have that wonderful experience before? Yeah. It's not just sorrow. It's deep sorrow, the kind that swallows you up. And what about heartache? That's emotional anguish or grief typically caused by the loss or absence of someone loved. So whether it's death, a relationship ending, or even watching a loved one lose their faculties, it all boils down to the same thing: grief and heartache. Now, whenever I experience grief, I just go to CVS and get some pills. I mean, they just make it better. Wouldn't that be nice? That's not how it works. There is no prescription for heartache and grief. But some people do try to self-medicate. Others just ignore it. But grief and heartache are a bit like seasickness. When I was in the Coast Guard, we knew better. Especially the new sailors, you better take your Dramamine. That's seasickness medicine. If you didn't, and you were prone to seasickness, well, buddy, you were in for a rough ride. It was absolutely miserable. You can't do anything for somebody who's seasick. We used to literally just walk over them and be like, sorry, because there was nothing you could do for them. They had to just ride it out. Grief and heartache are a lot like that. It messes with your balance. It may be hard to eat, hard to sleep, or maybe even pushing you to eat and sleep more than usual. Either way, it throws you off. For seasickness, the solution is just physical. Lay there and wait it out. But when it comes to grief and heartache, we're going to be talking about a whole different realm, the realm of the mind. And the mind has its own ways of coping. Now, I'm not saying you could get rid of grief, but I'm just going to say that we can alleviate its often devastating power over us. Whenever you see Jesus healing people in the Bible, it's mostly not physical. Often he's healing people on the inside, untangling the knots of their minds and restoring balance to their spirits. That's the kind of healing, that's the kind of therapy that the gospel offers. Think about when Jesus died. His disciples were grieving, and what does he tell them? Don't grieve, go and preach the gospel. Please don't say that to anybody who's grieving right now, but for Jesus' disciples, that made sense. So what's the principle here? What can we extract that's helpful? When you're grieving, do something. Do something. Don't sit and brood over the loss. Don't let your mind play the what if game on repeat. Get up and move. Physical strain alleviates mental strain. It'll distract you from your grief for a moment. It'll get the blood flowing. It'll give you some rest. And in that, you'll find some strength. Last week, in the middle of everything going on with my family, Theo offered to preach for me. We were taking our son to the ER, and it was one of those chaotic weeks. I could have easily stayed home and let Theo step in. But I said, no, I'll preach. Maybe next week it will be better. Why? Because if I stayed home, I would have just sat there stewing, mulling things over. That wouldn't have been helpful at all. In fact, it might have pushed me further into heartache. Instead, I got up, came to church, preached, and you know what? That helped me. Even though it was hard, it gave me a break from everything for a little while. Right after church, I went back into the cauldron, dealing with things, but the few hours of doing something positive, something that required energy, gave me a bit of respite. During the week, I didn't want to see anybody, but I went to 4 or 5 meals with people. And you know what? Our church has awesome people in it. I was able to talk, joke, laugh, and for a little while, forget everything going on. I found relief from all the heaviness. Did you know that if you asked somebody here for coffee, they actually would say yes? I just want to give that reminder. If you want to go for lunch, sometimes people say, I can't meet anybody. Well, stop saying that. Go meet somebody. And you can do that here. But here's the point. Let's get back to this sermon. When you're grieving, it's okay to step out of it for a little bit. It's okay. You don't want to spend all your time in grief. It's a natural feeling, but it needs to be managed. When grief comes, it's going to bring heaviness. You lose motivation, you want to isolate, and the weight can be absolutely crushing. But don't let it keep you down. Counter it with physical activity. Stay connected with your loved ones, even if it's just for a short time. Take a break from your grief. You are absolutely allowed to do it. The second thing to do not resist grief and heartache. For when they come, they're kind of like a flood. And this town knows about floods. Don't try to swim against the power. When it hits, it's going to wipe you out. You may want to scream. You may want to cry. You may want to express your sorrow. Guess what? Do it. Do it. Express it. The other day, my daughter told me she's never seen me cry. I was shocked. I cry all the time. If you put Moana or Toy Story 3 on, I'm done. But I have a move. I have this move where I'm like, so maybe that's why she's never seen it. But here's the truth. Grief is like a flood. It literally is like a flood. And guess what happens inside when the flood comes? It starts to leak out. You gotta just let it leak out. The body is telling you, let it out. If you bottle it up, guess what? Watch this. It's gonna manifest in other ways. And those ways are not pretty. So don't be afraid to release it, but be reasonable. You may want to punch something, but go find a punching bag. You gotta manage your emotions. When it's time to express grief, let it out. Cry, yell, talk to God about how you're feeling. Just don't do anything you'll regret. The trick is managing it. You are the ruler of your mind. Finally, we got to get biblical. We're in church, okay? Here's where we talk about the spiritual side of grief. Everything else I've mentioned, anybody can do physical activity. Anybody can express their emotions. Anybody can do those things. But here's where faith comes in. If you've ever thought the belief in life after death was ridiculous, well, Paul thinks you're ridiculous. Because he wants to address this for real. We believe in an afterlife as Christians, don't we? I need to hear it from everybody. Do we believe in an afterlife? Otherwise, Paul says, if there's no afterlife, go party, eat, drink, and be merry. It is a core belief. And some of us want to believe it, I know. But it's sometimes hard because it's not 100% clear, right, where we're going. So let me explain it like this. This really happened this week. I have a cat, Lyric. He follows me around everywhere, almost to an annoying degree. He's always with me, like behind me, but we don't speak the same language. The other day, he was just staring at me. I opened the fridge, I closed it, and I was like, what are you? He was staring right at me. And I said, what do you want, buddy? And he just kept staring at me. I said, you want a drink? You want something to eat? He just stared at me. He had no idea what I was saying to him. But he knew I was there, and he trusts me. He doesn't need to understand everything. He knows I take care of him. That's why he follows me around. That's what it's like with God. We may not understand everything he says or does. We're like my cat, trusting, but limited in our understanding. But Paul reminds us that for those who are spiritual, things that don't make sense to the unspiritual, if you do this, they'll start to click. We may not get it fully at first, but we trust and abide until we do. For thousands of years, hear this, for thousands of years, people have believed in some kind of afterlife. People who've had near-death experiences describe it being in the presence of loved ones that they spent time grieving over. They see a light, and they feel like they're in bliss. That's the science of death. It's what we know from those who've come from the other side. And whenever I hear these stories, my intuition lights up because I believe they're speaking sincerely. I'm not going to stand here to tell you exactly what happens when we die, because truthfully, nobody knows for sure. But what we do know from countless stories and experiences is that the reports are almost always the same. A sense of peace, the presence of loved ones, a light at the end of the tunnel. And when people are asked if they want to come back from that life back into our life, the response is this. This is how I know. I don't care where I end up, just that I know that this place exists. That gives me a lot of comfort. Christ came to give us glimpses of the heaven that we're going to inherit. He told his disciples, you got to come and see, not read a book. Come and see. He invited them to witness something. He was showing them how to deal with life as spiritual beings in a physical world. Just the other day, I was in my car and I felt God speaking to me. He said, Sean, I came to you as God. And he said, you come to me as a man. You don't have to be me. You just have to be a human. And with that, I was able to grieve some of my stuff. And I let go of the need to have all the answers. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do in our grief is just let go and trust. It's like when we took Max to the doctor. I trusted the professional. I didn't need to understand every single part of the treatment plan. I just trusted that they knew what they were doing. And who's the professional of all things? God, isn't it? The one who watches over us, who knows what we need, even when we're staring at him with our cat brains confused and uncertain. God speaks to us in ways we don't always understand, but like my cat who eventually catches my gesture. When I gesture for him, we can trust that he can take care of us. I want to be like that with God. I want to trust him even though I don't see the full picture. He knows what he's doing. Paul writes in one of his letters, we only see in part, but God sees the whole thing. And what do his promises say? They tell us that death and loss are how we see things. When I was a kid, if the Mets lost the World Series, this opportunity, done. I was done for. But now that I'm older, I know that it's just a game. Sorry, Yankees fans. In the same way, as we grow spiritually, we realize that loss is not the end of the world. We may feel like it in the moment, but God's perspective, if adopted, can help give us a bigger perspective. As we grow spiritually closer to God, we start to see things more like He does. And when we learn to hold on to God, we see one key ingredient that we need to have: hope. I love the word hope, but it is like vegetables. It's something you know that's good for you, but you don't always want to employ it. You don't always want to put it down. Hope can be hard to hang on to when you're dealing with grief, but it's essential. Today I've given you a few healthy vegetables, practical ways to deal with grief. Physical activity, staying connected with loved ones, expressing your feelings, these are things that help us manage grief. A candle is allowed to flicker every now and then. Just make sure it doesn't go out. Christ wants us to remember that today. Grieving is a part of life. Grief is not the end, and heartache is not the end. There's more, and that more is where our hope comes from. So when you're in the thick of it, when grief and heartache feel overwhelming or too much to bear, don't fight it, but don't let it consume you either. Move, connect, express, and trust. Move, connect, express, and trust. Trust that God, who sees the whole picture, has promises for you that go beyond this present pain. Trust that while we only see a sliver, He sees the whole, and He's going to guide us through it. And remember this. Even in the midst of our grief, there is still good news. Even in our darkest moments, God's light still shines. Christ's story, the gospel, is a tragedy that ends in triumph. And so will yours.